Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. You can now watch us on TV. Florida Roundtable airs on Saturdays at 9 on Tough TV 38 in Orlando.
And we hope if you're in the Orlando area, we'll take advantage of that. Our special guest later in the hour, currency expert and monetary historian Andy Gause. And boy, does he have some upsetting financial theories that we're going to talk about. Strong notions. Stay put. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. Always a pleasure to be with you on the air and on TV, Reagan.
A delight to share these quarters with you once again this week, Al. And I think we've got some interesting and very quick conversation. This hour is just going to fly by.
Oh, I have no doubt.
Yeah.
Let me tell you about our new TV partner,
Yes.
Tough TV 38. You can pick them up over the air with an antenna in Orlando. Also in select apartment complexes and mobile home parks in Central Florida, and Tough TV 38 is also carried on Channel 69 on the Summit Broadband cable TV system. And if you don't receive Tough TV, ask your cable system or satellite provider to carry it today.
Yeah. I don't know how you can get through a week without seeing us on TV.
I can't either.
All right. Well, we've got a bunch of things. Oh, you know what? We should also mention here myflanews.com.
myflanews.com. While we're on the subject, you can find out the latest about Florida news as it affects you. Also nationally and internationally. That's myflanews.com. Also, you can listen to Florida Roundtable archived shows.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Now, we've got some interesting stories to talk about before we get to our special guest today.
Some of our other governors in our great union of the United States are getting a little angry at Governor Rick Scott. They're calling him Governor Poacher. Governor Rick Scott, 8 states are now up in arms over the Governor Scott's "My State is Better Than Yours" playground pitch to recruit businesses from their respective states to Florida. His Maverick One-Way campaign criticizes each of those states, all run by Democratic governors, of course, for their bad business policies. He then directly solicits their business executives in mass mailings to move their companies to Florida's presumably better business climate. Started earlier this year, the campaign has the targeted states howling foul, along with more colorful retorts. Quote, "The way you build a dynamic economy isn't by running around trying to poach other states," sniffs one California's economic development spokesman. "Florida is the most crazy state in the union." So that's an interesting story.
Yeah.
And kind of interesting, the politics involved, that he's only criticizing the states with Democratic governors. Also, I want to mark the anniversary of Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech 50 years ago this week. And it was very interesting looking at the background of the speech. It was for economic prosperity and freedom for African Americans. And that has been achieved, both have been achieved to a large extent in the last 50 years. What's interesting, though, in 1963, we did have a pretty roaring economy and everybody had jobs. And now it seems like we should have a march with every ethnic group represented for economic freedom and for freedom and jobs, because I think we have much less freedom than in 1963, and there are much less jobs than in 1963, Reagan.
I wouldn't argue that for a heartbeat, Al. It's some of the folks who were at the original speech were back for this one. They drew probably about 50,000 people down to Washington, D.C., certainly not the crowd that they had in 1963. And, it's hard because I vaguely remember I was an early teenager And so it's the slippage of 50 years is a little bit sometimes tough to get your head around, but it was marked in fine style. Well, we'll pause along the network line. Let us remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
We'll be joined by financial historian Andy Gause as the program continues. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised at this point in the program, we are joined by a gentleman who has been with us several times before. We always enjoy having Andy Gause with us. And Andy, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back.
For those who are not aware, you, of course, are a monetary historian, a currency expert, author, par excellence, multiple books out there.
Man About Town.
Have we missed anything?
Raconteur.
No, you got it all. Especially the raconteur part. That was a good one.
Snazzy dresser. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Snazzy dresser. Yeah.
All right. Well, the occasion of our visit this day is a look at the Federal Reserve. Much in the news here lately, speculation, who is going to be nominated to replace Ben Bernanke and all that sort of a thing. But Mr. Bernanke has announced that he's getting ready to remove this quantitative easing, quote unquote, intravenous feeding needle. What else can we call this?
I guess you could say, yeah, exactly. The feeding needle, or what exactly is quantitative easing for people that are unaware? Of course, most people are unaware of what the Fed does anyway. Yeah. So if you could enlighten us on that, Andy.
Well, since there's no substance behind our money, right? Our money used to be so much, a dollar was so much silver, so much gold. Once President Nixon closed the gold window officially and allowed the dollar to float, then there was no set quantity of dollars in circulation. That fluctuated according to the needs of the economy. So quantitative, from the word quantity, and easing the quantity, it's like letting out your suits, when you've eaten too much.
I know that feeling personally, Andy.
Yes, me too. That's why I used it. I think we all do. Yeah. And in this case, we ate too much debt. In 2004, 5, 6, we were going crazy with allowing debt to be created. In fact, we allowed the commercial banks to create 3 times as much debt as there was actual money to pay. Now, this has happened to us before. During the roaring 20s, in the heyday there, when everybody was borrowing money to buy everything, Florida land and stocks in New York, it was a boom time indeed. And then, of course, someone realized there's not enough money to pay all these debts, and the call and broker loans, precipitated a crisis that resulted in what we know as the Great Depression. Now, the solution then was to simply bust the economy out and pay everyone 30 cents on the dollar. Because, if you have 3 times as much debt as money, when you sell everything, what's left over, 1/3 as much money as there was debt, so everyone gets 30 cents on the dollar. And in that process, the economy comes to a grinding halt as everything is thrown onto the market and auctioned and sold and so forth. So this time around, they decided to do something a little differently. In fact, this was Mr. Bernanke's thesis in college, got his PhD with. It was that had the Federal Reserve in 1929, instead of shutting off the supply of money, had they simply doubled the supply of money or even tripled it, then you would have enough money to pay all of the debts. Decent logic. And so put into effect during this cycle, if you remember QE1, back in, 2009. Actually, they didn't talk about quantitative easing 1 because about $600 billion of that money wound up in the European banks. Then, of course, there was the second quantitative easing, QE2, which gave us another $1 trillion, which largely went onto U.S. banks' balance sheets. And then now, of course, QE3, which has been called QE Infinity, because I don't know. I guess the best analogy here would be a drug abuser. That's what our economy has become, and the Fed is the drug dealer. Now, true, I suppose we could chain the economy to a radiator and cut it off, because that's about what it would take. You would have to hold it down. Obviously, we have that same addiction that's so powerful that if the Fed even hints that it's going to cut it off, stop the growth, stop the quantitative easing, the stock market plunged, gold and silver plunged, interest rates rose, and it was just a harbinger, I think, of what was coming down the pike. So that, in a nutshell, is quantitative easing. Of course, it took a little longer than I anticipated, but ask a guy like me what time it is, and I'll tell you how to build a clock. But in this case, I hope you understand.
It's kind of like the money is the heroin then.
Precisely.
Exactly. And Bernanke is the drug dealer. And the American economy is the and the American economy is the drug user. That's a very good analogy, Andy.
Yeah.
It goes back, and when I knew we were going to interview you, I one of my favorite quotes, and I can't remember who said it. I was reading so much stuff, but it's an old quote who says, "Whoever controls the money supply controls the nation." Is that what it is?
Well, that was said by several people, but the originator of that was a guy named Mayer Bauer Amschel Rothschild, and he said, "Give me the power to coin a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws." So that's a pretty decent quote. I think it makes a lot of sense. It doesn't really matter who sits on the throne, I think, was one of his other statements.
So then, if you take that all the way through, then Bernanke really is the true power broker of America, not the president, not Congress, not the judiciary. It would be Ben Bernanke and the Fed.
Well, I don't think anyone would argue that point. Think about it this way. When Lehman Brothers was allowed to go bankrupt, but Goldman Sachs was bailed out, so it was a choice. And obviously, had he made the other choice, then Lehman Brothers would still be here, and Goldman Sachs would be out of business. So it is indeed in the power of the chairman of the Fed to decide who stays and who goes. And his frequent and copious quantities of newly created money are the grease of that of those skids. Sure. And most certainly the commercial banks, member banks of the Federal Reserve System, which incidentally are the owners of that system, they're the ones that have benefited most dramatically from this quantitative easing. I thought simply if the Fed, if they wanted to stimulate the economy or restart the economy, they could have given us an income tax holiday. They could have mailed a check for $5,000 to every taxpayer in America. Both of those would have been cheaper, would have cost us less than what they eventually did, which was to pour money into the bank's vaults and hope that they would loan us some of it. And that, to me, printing money to get yourself out of trouble is insane enough. But what do you call borrowing printed money? That seems to me to be the height of insanity, and that's what we're engaged in now.
I want to pause for a second here just to put some size on it so the folks have a notion. Like Al, it made me think back across the years. And in the mid-1960s, in the Lyndon Johnson years, Everett McKinley Dirksen was the minority leader of the U.S. Senate, and many times at odds with President Johnson. Many times he worked with him on things. But he started talking about how our debt had mushroomed and blossomed and federal spending was out of control. And Senator Dirksen was fond of saying $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. And
That's right. But, curiously enough, Mr. Dirksen said $1 million here, $1 million there.
Yeah.
And we've grown so immune to that billion and now trillion that we don't realize just how much that really is. And in fact, we didn't have our first $1 trillion in money until Ronald Reagan took office.
Yeah.
I remember there was a news story about that, and everyone was going, the first $1 trillion budget, and it was this. It sounded so enormous at the time.
Well, that was even later. Now, I'm referring to all the money. If you took all the money in circulation when Ronald Reagan took office and put it in a pile, took everyone's money, emptied the banks, took what the Federal Reserve at the time called M3, when they stopped telling us that number now. But back in those days, they would count every dollar that was created, and we only had $1 trillion in circulation. By the time Bill Clinton took office, there were $5 trillion in circulation. Wow. And then by the time Mr. Obama took office, there were $17 trillion in circulation. And now the Fed has added, in the last 4 years, $3 trillion more. It seems as though as much as our Congress will spend in deficit, that's how much money the Federal Reserve is willing to create. And quite frankly, even their own projections show that by the time Mr. Obama leaves office, we'll have $20 trillion in circulation. And the national debt has shown no signs of easing. In fact, will continue to rise for the, deficits as far as the eye can see, to paraphrase Franklin Raines.
Yeah, I wanted to get a figure on this so folks can kind of grasp what we're talking about here and your notions. The Fed has been injecting an average of $85 billion every month into the economy. $85 billion
and they're
a
doing
month.
It largely through the purchase of Treasury securities, which has driven interest rates down, and that's commendable enough. But secondarily, what they've done is all of these mortgage-backed securities that were created and sold into the economy during the go-go early part of 2000, those are the instruments that the Fed has been buying. So they've purchased nearly $1.25 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities from the banks and the entities that were stuck with them after their creation. And the problem that I have with that is that these member banks they'll take a pile of mortgages, let's say $1 million worth of mortgages, put them in a pile, and then dice them and slice them to create securities that might be worth $1.5 million. And that extra $500,000 is all in the form of profit or commissions or underwriting fees, whatever you want to call them. But at the end of the day, the Fed lays out $1.5 million, and the banks profit enormously through the creation of these mortgage-backed securities. So again, demonstrating the power of the Fed to decide who prospers and who suffers.
Let me ask you this question. Does the Fed do anything? Obviously, we like to rag on the Fed, but is there any purpose for the Fed? Can the Fed, at this point, you're not going to get rid of the Fed, obviously, but
no.
Is there any saving grace here? I'm trying to look for the rainbow here, or some type of sunshine.
And there is one, because the operations of the Federal Reserve very similar to the independent sub-treasury of the 1838, 1846 period, right? Mm-hmm. It is the clearer of our transactions. It clears checks. It creates Fedwire, manages and maintains the money supply. I mean, it performs a lot of good functions. The only problem that I have with the entire affair is that it's privately owned. I mean, if you take the entire operations of the Fed and move it into the Treasury, and in this fashion, any profits that are generated by the Fed are deposited in the Treasury and can then be drawn upon through appropriation by Congress. The way that it operates now is that these Federal Reserve banks are private corporations, and each of them keeps whatever they earn and then pays their expenses and then returns whatever's left to the Treasury at the end of the day. So what the movie people call a net deal, we get what's left over after they've paid all of their expenses, and we, the people and the Congress, don't get to look at those expenses or approve them. This is what led Ron Paul to his crusade to audit the Fed. I agree. I'm not saying abolish the Fed or put them out of business, but at very least, their profits should go into the Treasury of the United States, and they should have to ask for an appropriation from our Congress like every other federal agency. The idea that they could keep the money that they earn, which is enormous, and then use that money for whatever purpose they see fit and then return to us the change. It reminds me of when Grandma used to send me to the store. Here's a $20 bill, Andy. Get me a loaf of bread and some milk and buy a little something for yourself and bring me back the change. She was lucky if she got $1 back. By the time I stuffed my face with fruit pies and drank sodas and played pinball, there was nothing left of
You would have been a good Fed operative, I think.
There it is.
And certainly I would have been a good Fed chairman.
Yes.
Now,
Andy, I tell you what, hold on to that thought, because we need to take a pause along our network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is financial historian Andy Gause, and we will continue our conversation following these messages.
All right.
From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest this day is one of our favorites here on the Florida Roundtable, Andy Gause, financial historian, monetary expert. And Andy, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Andy, for people who are unaware, if you ask most people on the street what the Federal Reserve is, they will say it's a government agency. It obviously is not. Let's do a little history lesson and kind of explain to people how the Fed came about, under what circumstances, and why it's private.
Well, it's funny. People, when they think of the history of the Fed, go back to 1913. And that's when the current incarnation was brought into being. But in reality, this battle over the issuance of money goes back to the founding of the Republic. And about 20 minutes after the ink was dry on the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton presented a plan that would create a central bank, a bank of issue. This is the bank that issues the money and takes the deposits from the government. And it was to be called the Bank of the United States, and part of it was to be owned by the government, and the rest of it was to be owned by private shareholders. Now, a great many founders were against this concept, of course the most famous being Thomas Jefferson, who said that he believed that these banks were more dangerous than standing armies, and that if there was an issuing power, then it was meant to be used by Congress and not given over to private entities. Well, I don't know, against the better judgment of Mr. Jefferson, this first Bank of the United States was chartered, and it was chartered for a period of 20 years. And during that period, many of the congressmen complained that the interests that owned the private side, again, we were partners. Congress owned some, people owned some, and then individual investors owned the rest. Well, these investors were largely the same people that we had just won our independence from. Madison referred to it as snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Once we had given this power to create money to this quasi-private institution, then they simply did what was in the best interest of shareholders. Now, granted, we, the people, were part shareholders, but that quickly changed. Congress was convinced that we should sell our shares, much like the GM and Fannie Mae argument that's going on right now. We sold our shares to private investors, and then the bank became entirely private. Now, once they were private, they sort of ran nuts. By the time 1812 came, when the charter expired, Congress said, no way, we're not renewing this charter. You guys are out of business. And curiously, the federal government found itself at war with the British, who decided that, let's try this again. Well, we didn't do too well in that war. They burned the White House and chased off the president and Dolly Madison from Washington. But as soon as we capitulated and chartered the second Bank of the United States, the British withdrew. So in 1814, here came the second incarnation, second Bank of the United States, this time entirely privately owned and entirely at the controls of the U.S. economy. Their charter lasted 20 years until the age of Andrew Jackson, who came and said, hey, we don't need this bank creating money. We're going to kill the bank. If you vote for me, I will kill the bank, and that's what he did. So those bank wars in the 1830s had everything to do with getting private entities out of the issuance of money. In this case, though, they went too far. They democratized the issue of money. So they said no one person or entity will have the monopoly to issue money. Anyone can issue notes for money. So you and I could start a bank, and put $10, $20 gold pieces in our vault, issued $10, $20 bills, and away we went. Well, the problem there was that a great many charlatans put $10, $20 gold pieces in the vault, issued $100 $20 bills, and then left town with the $10, $20 gold pieces that they started with. So they decided, after the panic of 1907, that they need to take this power away from everyone and concentrate it in the hands of the most trusted bankers of the day, the Bernie Madoffs of 1913.
Yeah, trust in bankers, to me, sometimes doesn't ring exactly true in the last few years. But
yeah. Well, they put this Federal Reserve in place in 1913, and they gave them the exclusive monopoly power to issue money. And for the first few years of its existence, boy, they were scrupulous. So if they issued a $20 bill, you bet they had a $20 gold piece or 20 silver dollars in their vault. And anytime you came in and said, here's my $20 bill, give me my $20 gold piece, they were there ready to pay it. And so confidence grew. And in those first few years, everything was fine until Britain found itself involved in a war. And since many would argue that the ownership of the Fed at that time was predominantly British investors, so then when it came time for the British to borrow money to prosecute this war, where else to turn but the Federal Reserve? And so the Federal Reserve created buckets of additional money that they didn't have gold and silver to back up and loaned it to Great Britain. And as all this money came back to the United States at the war's end, that's where we had the roaring 20s. They were roaring because, as I said, there was 3 times as much debt as there was money to pay. Quite honestly, the Federal Reserve has evolved during that period from a position of, they used to have to keep a certain amount of gold or silver on reserve for every dollar that they issued. They don't have to do that anymore. They used to have to maintain at least the semblance of impartiality by only buying United States Treasury bonds, and now they can buy anything they want. If you want to take out a paper bag and write, I owe you $1 billion, and hand it to the Federal Reserve, they're allowed to create $1 billion and hand it to you. So they've evolved into this completely privately held institution, and the reason that is given to us, to we the people, is if you let Congress have the power to issue money, the next thing you know, they're going to be spending money like it's going out of style, spending $1 trillion or more than they take in every year, and buying every foolish and silly thing that there is to buy. Well, I would argue that that's what Congress does now, and the Treasury has never heard from the Fed, hey, we're not financing that crazy debt that you're incurring. In fact, the Fed encourages the Treasury, but it allows the Congress to hide. Well, it's not us, it's the Fed. Go talk to the Fed, because we're not in on monetary policy.
Hey, Reagan, by the way, as an aside, you got any paper bags laying around, man?
Yeah, I do. I was just looking for one, yeah.
Think about the power that you can wield by having the ability to monetize debt. That is the ultimate power indeed, and the Fed has the exclusive right to that power. It seems sad to me that, and you hear many people say this, oh, the government's just printing money. They're just going to print our way out of this trouble. Well, if it were that simple, at least we would print money. We'd have inflation, but we wouldn't pay interest on it. The way it is now, the Fed prints the money and then loans it to the Congress and charges interest. So, I mean, I'm absolutely opposed to this notion, and I would take, again, the Fed, just as it stands, lock, stock, and barrel, and move it into the Treasury Department and allow the Treasury, once again, to issue our money.
What do you think the odds of that happening are?
Yeah. Not the same as the odds of me becoming Fed chairman.
We have less than a minute, but my question is, why haven't we seen more, briefly, why haven't we seen more inflation?
Well, the inflation is pent up. They create these trust funds. The Social Security Trust Fund is one. The Medicare and Medicaid Trust Fund is another. Highway Trust Fund, Airport Trust Fund. I found 170 separate trust funds, and it simply works like this. We need a tax to fix the roads. Great. $1 trillion in tax money. We're going to put it in a pile. You think we're going to fix the roads with that? No. We're going to borrow it. We're going to spend it on what we really wanted to spend it on and leave the $1 trillion sitting as an account entry. Only when that $1 trillion is spent on the roads will the inflation ensue. So all of this spending has resulted in these piles of IOUs in various trust funds. We've borrowed everything out of the Social Security Trust Fund, nearly $3 trillion, but yet we show that the Social Security Trust Fund has $3 trillion in it. It's IOUs. We've done the same thing with the highways and the airports. In fact, almost $6 trillion has been looted from various trust funds and IOUs put in their place. So in this manner, as long as those IOUs are not converted, then we never see the inflation. And this is the where the rubber meets the road. As Social Security receipts dwindle, as more workers retire, now we have to turn these IOUs into money, and that's why you hear all of this talk of reforming Social Security, because, quite frankly, they don't want to pay it back.
Yeah. On that note, Andy, we need to pause again along our network line. Let us remind folks that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest, currency expert and monetary historian Andy Gause, and we will continue our conversation following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, one of our favorites here on the Roundtable, monetary historian Andy Gause. We know how busy you are, sir, and we certainly appreciate you taking all this time to chat with us once again today.
Thank you.
And all kidding aside, Andy, one of the reasons we brought you on the show, there's something happening in a month that people should be aware of. And
right.
It's not exactly a good thing, but you know, when you listen to Florida Roundtable, you get the straight dope and you get the scoop ahead of a lot of the media. So let's talk about this.
Well, it's that pesky debt ceiling again. Our new Treasury Secretary, many have not even heard of him, a gentleman named Jack Lew, has reported that by the middle of October, we'll have less money in our checking account, our national checking account, than Apple Computer does.
Wow.
So we're running out of money once again. And our ability to borrow has been severely curtailed by this debt ceiling. Republicans have said that they're going to force a showdown, and Mr. Lew is trying to prevent that showdown. No question that we will hit our debt limit by the middle of October, and unless we increase, that's the only choice, unless we increase the amount of debt that we can incur, we're going to default again. So that same argument that spurred a major crisis in 2011 is coming back to haunt us again. Only this time, it's going to be so much worse than it was then that a simple, mild increase just won't do it. We're going to need a serious dose, probably raising the debt ceiling by $1 trillion or more. And that, of course, I think will rattle the market.
But the Republican House is against all this, obviously. And so where do we go from? Where do we go from here? Are we going to get another default rating? Are we going to get our credit rating lowered again? Are we going to have to go through this every couple of years? What do you foresee?
Well, they're already using extraordinary measures, like they're taking the money from the employees' retirement plans. They're using every dollar that is laying around in any point. So there won't be any extraordinary operations that can be taken. The only thing that can be done at that point is a default. And quite honestly, I don't think we're ready. I understand the logic of saying, okay, you either cut spending or we're not going to give a debt increase. That makes perfect sense to me. But at the end of the day, the rest of the world won't understand. And if they start dumping Treasury debt, there's only one place for it to go, and that's here at home. And boy, that inflation you were talking about then, you'll see it in a big way.
So what can the average consumer do to protect themselves from this?
Well, the Constitution only gave us one protection, and that was when they specified what money was. And it's Article 1 of the Constitution. No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt. I don't know if anyone has noticed, but gold and silver had been rising dramatically the entire time that the Fed was quantitatively easing the money supply. But the moment Mr. Bernanke said we're not going to do it anymore, gold and silver dropped. Well, I think the realization is starting to set in now that he was bluffing. Of course they're going to keep doing it. The new Fed chair, Janet Yellen, is also going to keep doing it. So I think that quantitative easing is here to stay. And once the markets realize this, then you'll see the price of gold and silver skyrocket once again. I have actually 3 audio CDs I've offered to your listeners before The first one is called The Definition of Money, helps you to understand what money is and where it comes from. The second one is The Federal Reserve, deals strictly with the Fed and how it operates. And then the third one is the commercial one. It is Protecting Your Wealth. And that one tells you how to move your money from the Federal Reserve note into lawful constitutional money. I'll offer those 3 CDs and my newsletter free to any of your listeners if they'll just call and say they heard it on the Florida Roundtable. 800-468-2646. That's 800-468-2646. Mention the Florida Roundtable, and you'll get those 3 CDs and the newsletter free. So you can educate yourself. I guess that's the most important thing that citizens can do between now and October.
And that is the best offer you're going to get today, let me tell you. 800-468-2646. Andy Gause, monetary historian extraordinaire. It is always a pleasure to have you with us on the Florida Roundtable. We hope that lots of people will take advantage of your generous offer and educate themselves as to what is going on here. Wow. I mean, it's stunning, and we hope that some folks will avoid getting hit directly between the eyes with this by taking advantage of the offer you've made here today.
I want to thank you for coming back on, Andy. We always enjoy having you on the show.
Thank you so much, sir.
I enjoy being with you.
We'll do it again soon. This is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al and I will be back with a closing thought following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And always a pleasure having Andy Gause with us, and we look forward to having him back again. We like to let a couple of 3 months go by, and then we'll have him back and get an update from
but every time 3 months goes by, everything sounds worse. Well, that's the breaks, I guess. If you want to change things, you got to get informed and write your representative. That's what this republic is supposed to be all about, right?
There you go.
Winners and losers of the week in Florida. This is our new thing we're doing. The winner of the week in Florida this past week is John Thrasher. Mm-hmm. If we had to put money on anyone to become Rick Scott's next lieutenant governor, like we really need that position, as we've noticed, how long has the
state's been doing quite well without one.
The position's been empty, and we haven't had any problems whatsoever. Yeah. It would be the conservative state senator, a former House Speaker, John Thrasher, with Scott's chief of staff, Adam Hollingsworth, personally handling the selection. A trusted and sharp ally from the Jacksonville area might just be the ticket.
John has always been a friend of this show, and he's been here in the studio with us several times, so we'll keep an eye on that one.
Now, the loser of the week, Allison Tant, exactly the kind of leader we need in Tallahassee, the quote goes. That's what the Democratic chairwoman said of Allie Braswell. The political unknown, she appointed as her preferred nominee for CFO. Within days, however, Braswell dropped out amid revelations of several bankruptcies. Oh. Here's a novel idea, Allison. Try some basic vetting of your candidates.
Yeah, I would say so.
Before you put your name behind them.
Okay.
Also, right. Here's an interesting story we have about, I've noticed this recently, in the time we have left, that there are some people claiming to be journalists that are definitely taking a certain side. And, of course, Daniel Ellsberg, remember the Pentagon Papers guy, has been chiming in, specifically about this journalist called Jeffrey Toobin. He's taken the role of an anti-Glenn Greenwald. Glenn Greenwald, of course, is the journalist who broke Snowden. And the story there. And, of course, he is the most visible journalist arguing that Edward Snowden's a criminal. In the eyes of other journalists, the opposition to the free flow of information can make Toobin seem like a traitor. Ellsberg, of course, the man who leaked the Pentagon Papers, takes a more unforgiving view of journalists like Toobin and Michael Grunwald, the Time magazine correspondent who twittered about having a droning attack on Julian Assange. He calls both of them government tools. The quote here is, I mean, every sense of the term of the government, Toobin and Grunwald are doing the work of the government to maintain relationships and access. Not very good news for journalistic integrity, Reagan.
Ellsberg's about 91 years old, I think. at this point.
I believe
But
so.
He's been around for a while. I want to take a moment and note the passing of former Ohio Governor John Gilligan. I had known the governor in many of press conferences. Served only one term. He wasn't. He had problems after 4 years. His predecessor, who had served 8 years, came back and beat the pants off of him. He became a trade emissary for Jimmy Carter, and we mentioned that he is the father of the current Health and Human Services Secretary, who also was the governor of Kansas, Kathleen Sebelius. I never was quite sure how Kathleen got from Ohio out to Kansas to become a governor there, but in any event, we remember the years when Ohio was known as Gilligan's Island.
Yes, and of course, when I heard about Gilligan, I went, Gilligan? I had to do that.
On that note, we say thank you for your time this day. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We'll see you again in 1 week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.